Okay. Susie, do you want to get us started?
Um, I asked the question earlier about the number of H1 and H2 visas. I think you only answered the part about H1 visas, which was for technical people. Isn't H2 visas dealing with agricultural workers?
Yes, and I apologize for cutting the answer short. I realized we were running low on time. H-1B visas are for technology workers. H-2 visas, you're exactly right, are for are actually for temporary non-agricultural jobs. So, for example, a construction or a factory worker or a hospitality worker can work on an H-2 visa, but the argument is the same. Those who want more of those visas argue that there aren't a sufficient number of Americans to fill those jobs. Those who think there are too many feel like the employers are just relying on a foreign uh, workforce that they can pay less money. And I think whether you're talking a highly skilled tech worker or perhaps a less skilled worker in one of these other fields, to me the answer is additional oversight to make sure that the people being brought in are filling a legitimate need, not just being used as a lower cost alternative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet.
I think we have a question in the chat here. Robert has a question.
Hi. During the debate on the federal troops coming to the various cities, this is something about the Trump administration that really bothers me. I don't see it so much as a plus or minus for the political parties or who wins or loses, but I see it as a real rehearsal for federal law, and the people that are afraid that Trump is ready to take over the cities with martial law, and that by 2028 he'll be able to declare that there's an emergency. We can't trust fair elections to take place, so we won't have them.
Well, as you know, Robert, on these we try to run a balance between policy and political questions. So by asking a political winner and loser question, I didn't mean to be minimizing the real world potential impact. But I think you're absolutely right to raise it and go deeper than we had a chance to in the regular webinar. I do think, to take my answer during the webinar a bit further, I think if the courts do rule that a president can still take those steps in times of emergency, but with a more specific and stricter definition of emergency, it does create an obstacle to the kind of potential outcome in 2028 that you're talking about. I'd be surprised to see any court, whether this one or any others, completely revoke that authority from a president. But if they can define it more specifically and more strictly, then I think it does offer the protections that you're talking about. But bringing up the politics about it wasn't meant to minimize anything.
But yeah, is there anything wrong, as I understand the current process is, they can bring the troops in at the request of the local authorities, either the mayor or the governor. And it has been done in situations where a local
Oh, yeah. And it's been done by mayors and governors of different parties than the president throughout most of the country's history. My guess, and it's a pure guess, because like I said, I'm not a lawyer, let alone a constitutional lawyer, so I have to be careful on this. But I would be surprised to see a court rule that a president could only exert that authority with, using a critic's or a skeptic's word, not mine, with only the permission granted by a mayor or governor. So I think a more specific set of circumstances is likely. I can't imagine they would rule in such a way to give a local or state elected official effective veto power over a federal administration's ability to act. So then the question becomes, how strict and how specific do you draw those boundaries? And for better or worse, I think this court's natural inclination is to say we deal in broad answers. If you want something more specific, that's what the legislative branch is for.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Carol has a question.
Mr. Kennedy spent a lot of today on the stand answering questions, and he has some interesting ideas and policies. What I think is most interesting is the states, California, Oregon, Washington, and various other states are forming their own units to get around the restrictions that he's put on the COVID-19 vaccine. Do you see that expanding?
Yeah, I think the ultimate legacy of Kennedy and of Trump on this issue is we're going to see red and blue states health policy. And I think that's a bad idea for all sorts of reasons, because it's not really that easy to restrict health matters by political boundaries. But you saw the state of Florida already acting today to eliminate any vaccine requirements in their public schools. And we saw Governor Newsom announce here with the governors of Oregon and Washington sort of a West Coast vaccine program. And I do worry that you are going to see blue and red states just heading off in two completely different directions on this. And I'm not a health expert anymore, I'm a constitutional expert, but I really don't know how you stop a disease at a state line. So that's probably not such a good idea in my regard. What's been interesting to me on this is the overwhelming majority of Americans believe very strongly in the need for vaccines. Those who disagree much more vehemently, and they're adamant about this. And the other types of, healthy food, healthy living types of steps that many of Kennedy's supporters prioritize are not directly related to vaccines, but these are the most important issues in their lives, processed foods and so on. And it's pretty clear that Trump's political advisors see former Kennedy supporters as a key constituency for Republican candidates in the midterm elections. And so they're inclined to give Kennedy more running room because they think that will keep his voters more motivated and more likely to turn out next year. But you already see, if you watch the hearings today, you saw Republican senators, Cassidy from Louisiana and Barrasso from Wyoming, both MDs, expressing profound discomfort with what Kennedy's doing. And though I don't think that this is sustainable on Kennedy's part, but I don't think you'll be able to get the White House to push back on him significantly until after the midterm elections.
Wait.
My question is, there have been a lot of reports about the meeting between China, Russia, and India, but no mention of all the other people that were in the background of these meetings and discussing what was going on vis-a-vis the United States, India, Russia, and China. What's your take on this?
It's one of the other issues we thought at the last minute about including today and throwing our program over, but at a certain point, you just got to go forward with what you have. Look, I'd say India's presence and the collegiality that Modi showed to Xi and to Putin was certainly the most important thing that came out of that conference. But you're exactly right. There weren't 3 countries. There were about 20. And most of them were Central Asian countries that, I don't want to be mean, but we have to say of relatively limited geopolitical importance. That doesn't mean that part of the world can't play an important role, but most of the countries were there as a backdrop for China and Russia. And I do think the fact that India, which not too long ago had been looked at as an Asian counterweight for the West vis-a-vis China, is now literally hand in hand with China's and Russia's leaders. creates a very difficult and a very challenging situation. So I don't want to suggest that the other countries there weren't important, but I think that photo of the three leaders holding hands was by far the most important thing that came out of the gathering.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat here by Christina. I can read it. What are your thoughts on the NYC mayoral campaign? Is Zoran's popularity indicative of the disenchantment with Trump, or is NYC an overall outlier?
Boy, it's a really good question, Christina. My own feeling is that Mandami's popularity is not so much a reaction against Trump as it is a reaction like Trump's against politics as usual and establishment politicians. So these are voters who are unhappy with the way politics has been practiced for a long time. Some of them vote for Donald Trump, some of them vote for Bernie Sanders, some for Zoran Mandami. This is their way of saying politics is messed up and I want something fundamentally different. It's easy to second guess, but if you wanted to anoint someone to defend a more traditional political system, I might not pick a former governor who had resigned in disgrace because of multiple scandals. But I do think that while Mandami's ideology, of course, is very, very far from Trump's, I think this is less a reaction to Trump than it is a Trumpish reaction from the other side of the spectrum toward politics, the way so many people are dissatisfied by it. You probably all saw that the Trump administration is reportedly considering offering Mayor Adams a job in the Trump administration, and Curtis Sliwa, the Republican candidate, a job in the administration as well. Because the belief is, of course, and I know you've all read this, is that both Andrew Cuomo and Eric Adams run against Mandami. They split each other's vote, and Mandami wins. But if one of them steps aside, the other one has a chance. My own feeling is I can't think of two men on the planet less likely to step aside for the greater good of anything than Andrew Cuomo and Eric Adams. And so I feel like this is the Trump administration's way of saying maybe we can cajole one of them out of the race. And even though Mandami would still be the favorite, at least potentially make it more competitive.
Nice. And then I saw Robert first, and then we can get to Susie in the corner. So Robert, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, in respect to the New York mayor's race, what do you think ranked choice voting had to do with the outcome or of that?
It's interesting, Robert. In almost every campaign, local and in Alaska and Maine state races where ranked choice voting has been used over the last several years, I could argue that it had a very pronounced effect on the outcome in terms of alliances between candidates, campaigns urging different candidates to be ranked as a second or third choice. I don't think it had much of a difference in the primary here. A Mandami's second choice, a Mandami voter's second choice is not that likely to be either Adams or Cuomo.
9:32.
So I think that while the ranked choice, I think it's a valuable reform to be implemented more broadly. Two, I think while it often has an important impact, I think in this race, had it been a more conventional voting system, I think we would have seen pretty similar results just because Mandami is such a different type of candidate than the other leaders. There was no one for him to split his vote with.
What do you think?
But I'm still a big fan of ranked choice.
Oh, okay. That was my next question is, you think ranked choice voting is the way to go for the future?
I think it's a great idea. I was never against it, but I always used to look at ranked choice voting, and for that matter, the top two primary is sort of the political equivalent of interleague baseball. I think it's neat that the Dodgers play the Angels and the Giants play the A's, but it doesn't really make a difference. But I think what top two primary has done, I was wrong, but top two primary has done, what ranked choice has done, is it's given centrist candidates a chance to be heard in a way that they wouldn't be heard under a more conventional system. The conventional system tends to reward the most liberal and the most conservative voices. It tends to be more absolutist. And I think a centrist candidate, being a centrist myself, I think can do better under these rules because it provides the voters a wider range uh, of options.
Thank you.
We'll go on to Susie.
Well, further to the New York, whither goes the Democratic Party? I know this is your field. You're a political strategist and consultant. The Democrats seem kind of moribund right now. To what do you attribute that, and what do you think their strategy is, and what do you think their strategy ought to be?
Okay, so first of all, I actually wrote my weekly column on this week, and the headline for it was don't anybody get mad at me because I'm an independent. I'm not on either side. The headline I wrote for the piece was when Democrats act like Democrats, and just talking about how divided the party is right now. And I talked about the Democratic National Committee meeting that took place last week. And for those of you who followed it, the stories, the headlines, and I'm putting a copy of the article in the chat if anyone would like to read it later. The headlines, the story that came out of the Democratic National Committee annual meeting was not a story about inflation, was not a story about tariffs, was not a story about immigration or Medicaid or any of the issues that the Democrats will presumably be using to try to win back Congress next year. The story that came out of the Democratic National Committee meeting was Gaza, which of course is an issue that deeply divides the party in a very deep and ugly way. And look, in a two-party system, the party outside of the White House is always divided. That's just the way a two-party system works. But I feel like this party, and if I understand correctly, this is the point of your question, this party is so divided, not just on the issues, but on its identity. And I wonder if the Democrats won't know who they are until they've picked a nominee in 2028, because you have such strong voices in different factions of the party. Now, I'll say this, and I make this point in the article also. Usually, parties resolve these differences every 4 years. Every presidential cycle, the parties, test their ideas against each other. One faction emerges, whether it's Bush or McCain or Romney or Trump, whether it's Clinton or Obama or Biden. So think about this. Democrats in 2020 didn't have that debate. In 2024 didn't have that debate because Harris became the nominee just 107 days before the election. In 2020, the Democrats didn't have that debate because a lot of the progressives decided that even though they weren't that excited about Biden, they were so unhappy with Trump, the progressive backed down and supported Biden anyway. So there really wasn't a test of the two wings of the party. In 2016, I say without a stake in the fight, that the progressive wing didn't have a chance to have its fight either because Clinton had started in such an advantaged position that even though Sanders challenged her, they still didn't really have that fight, at least on an even playing field. In 2012, Barack Obama was up for re-election. So the last time the Democrats really had a public argument about their identity and their direction was in 2008. And I think if you wait if you only do that every 20 years, different portions of the party, different factions within the party begin to go off in other directions. So I think the Democrats, there's no reason they can't come together in 2028. In fact, I think they probably will. But the fact that they haven't had that kind of public conversation and competition, ideological competition in what will be 20 years, I think really does create an obstacle for them beyond what out parties are normally facing.
Let me ask a follow-up to that. What
Yes.
about the midterms? Everyone's talking that the Democrats should, run the table substantially. That based on what you just said, that appears maybe it won't happen.
Well, that's the thing. In midterm elections, a party doesn't need to have an identity because there's not one campaign across the entire country. Each House race, each Senate race, each governor's race is a different campaign with different candidates and different identities. So I think of a presidential election. This is going to sound self-evident. A presidential election is nationalized. Um, Midterm elections tend to be more local and state-based. So the fact that a candidate for governor in Wisconsin is talking about something different than a candidate for senator in Georgia is not that big a deal. I do think in the midterms, even with this gerrymandering debate we're now seeing, I do think Democrats will have a considered advantage in the midterms next year. Uh, Historically, as we all know, the president's party tends to lose seats in midterm elections. And I do believe that as Trump loses support on some of his core issues like immigration, it's worth remembering that he won this last election by mobilizing a lot of young men to vote for him, who hadn't otherwise. And if they don't see jobs or lower inflation, I think they'll be less motivated to do so in a lower turnout midterm. So I think Democrats still do have an advantage next year. Um, but like I said, by the time they have their public reconnoitering in 2028, like I said, 20 years is a long time to wait.
Okay, I had some questions. Jim Grant would like to comment. Or Rick first. Rick was actually first.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Oh, okay. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
Yeah, I thought again, both the main session and our session is very interesting as always. It's great to see you. I had a follow-up question regarding, and I think you're right about possible court limitations on the use of federal troops. That it's more likely to be a narrowing rather than an absolutist yes he can or no he can't. Um, but I don't you think or I think that a lot of that is and Breyer's opinion that just came down on the use of troops in California a couple of days ago made this point that the arguments that the government was using, federal government was using in support of its troops were sort of kind of almost on their face pretextual, that they weren't really factually based, and that there wasn't any real emergency that they could articulate. And on the one hand, they were arguing that that all of their actions did comply with the limitations on federal power, but then on the other hand, they were saying those limitations don't apply. So, do you think? I mean, how do you think that issue about how real the president's rationale for the use of troops is will be important in these court cases?
I think it will be. And you could see how frustrated Judge Breyer was, as you correctly pointed out. He said, on one hand, you said that the administration followed all the rules. On the other hand, you said the president didn't have to follow the rules. Which is it? And it did seem in the eyes of Judge Breyer that the administration's lawyers were justifying the actions after they occurred, as opposed to setting up a premise under which those actions could take place. I think even a lawyer who supported the president would probably agree that they didn't do a great job of articulating their case to him, to the judge. But look, I'm surprised that he can go before a federal judge without having her story straight. By the time they get to the appeal, they're going to have to choose one or the other of these tacks. I don't know which they will choose, but Breyer was right. Trying to argue both left him with essentially no argument.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Jim?
Yeah, just Rick and Dan, I'm going to say very, very quickly on that. I think this administration will ignore any unfavorable ruling, as Emil Bove, now on the appellate court, has said that they should do. But I have to turn to my Democratic Party, and I am deeply troubled that we're having the discussion that we need to mute our response to this attack on our democracy. And I do see Trump as a threat. I do see him as a Stalinist type leader who does not deserve the office that he holds.
Jim,
And
I'm going to interrupt you for just a second because you
sure,
know how highly I think of you. But one of the
right,
things is you remember that we try to do in these gatherings, I work really hard to leave my personal opinions out and
right,
talk as an analyst and not an advocate. I
sure.
respect your beliefs like I would respect any participant's beliefs for or against Trump.
Mhm.
But I also know that most of the participants tune in for a conversation
Oh,
and an
absolutely.
analysis rather than someone trying to convince them to to agree. So
Right.
I
I'm not,
think I think I think the analysis is one thing, the screed is another.
yeah, no, I hear, and I don't mean to be going off in a screed, but I am again concerned that you would think that the Democratic Party would be a stronger voice in opposition to the administration and the fact that they are in fact muted when, I did raise my hand and swore an oath of allegiance to the Constitution, and so that's my perspective. I do feel that it is in fact being violated. And, just looking strategically at the Democratic Party, I think the fact that they are divided, if you will, or muted on what their response should be is a definite concern to me. Again, I understand your concern about screed, but we do appear in one perspective to be losing our democracy, and for the party to just simply be muted, I find to be quite disturbing.
Well, I do see your point, and I think making it without the personal references, I think makes it a really really smart analysis. I think you make a really good point. I will say this, not to defend the Democratic leadership any more than I defend Trump. As I said, this is not a bug, but a feature of a two-party system. Parties are divided, and they generally unify when they pick a leader. So this party, I think, is having a particularly difficult time with it because number one, Trump is such a unique leader, and they're still figuring out exactly how to counter him. Second, as I said earlier, because it's been so long since they've had a public countenance. But I think they're figuring out how to respond to him. And going back to the point we discussed earlier, in a midterm election, that's okay because different candidates for Congress and for Senate and for governor are going to talk about it in different ways with different constituencies. The nice thing about a primary process and the real unfortunate decision not to have even a very abbreviated primary last summer was it didn't give the party a chance to work these things out and decide how to move forward. So what they're doing now is they're having a discussion that under more normal circumstances, they would have had during last year's Democratic primary. But I would not, and I say this not as a partisan, but just as an observer, I would not give up hope because even when Democrats act like Democrats, um, in in September of 1989, I don't know that many observers would have selected the governor of Arkansas as the person to unite the party. And in August of 2005, I don't know that they would have picked a state senator, not even a U.S. senator yet, um, to be the person who unified the party 3 years after that. So I'm um, I think the prospects uh, are are there.
I hope you're right.
Okay.
Could you briefly comment on the gerrymandering of the districts between, of congressional districts, how that's going to go and how that's going to affect the midterms?
Well, I will say this, Robert. So all of you know, Texas is redrawing their lines, and they believe that will create 5 more Republican districts. California, if Newsom and his allies are successful, will pass a ballot initiative that would create 5 more districts that would more heavily favor Democrats. Plenty of other states, Missouri, Maryland, others, are looking at doing the same thing on a more limited basis. I don't think that these district line changes are going to have nearly as much impact as either party thinks. It's worth remembering that these lines were drawn 6 years ago, more than a half a decade. The world's changed a lot since then. So had nobody tried to redistrict in 2026, the lines would be fundamentally out of whack with where they were in 2020. Republicans believe that these 5 districts they win will come their way because of how Trump performed in 2024. But that presumes that Republican down-ticket candidates will do just as well with Latino male voters during a massive deportation surge as Trump did with those voters in 2024. Democrats in California are assuming that voters who supported Joe Biden over Trump in 2020 will react in exactly the same way 6 years later. But even though the Republican Party is not a viable statewide force here, in competitive races, voter attitudes on housing, on energy, on crime don't necessarily guarantee Republican success. But it's just such a dramatically changed playing field that while I understand what both parties are doing, they're scrambling for every possible advantage they can realize. I just don't think the advantages will be as automatic as they think they are. No. And to me, one of the real as a lifetime reformer, not a lifetime, but as a many decades reformer, the debate over Proposition 50 here in California is fascinating to me. Because I ultimately think the question that voters are being asked is, do you put aside even temporarily important democratic reforms in order to achieve a political outcome? Now, different people will tell you how important that political outcome is, and everyone's entitled to their own opinion on it. But the way I phrase it with people, and it sounds like I'm putting my thumb on the scale more than I intend to, I say, yeah, do you hate Trump more than you like do you hate Trump more than you love democracy? Because I worry, and I would do the same thing if I were living in Texas and not in California. I think changing these rules to weaken democracy has a worse impact than the outcome of a particular election. Now, I know a lot of people who believe that removing Trump from office is necessary in order to save democracy. And I respect that. But I worry about a lot of voters who just see politicians on both sides taking away those voters' rights. And I don't think that's a good foundation on which to build the democracy. That's not me advocating for Trump, not in the slightest. If you listen to me talk every month, I think you have a pretty good idea of where I come down on most of this stuff. But I worry that eliminating reforms on behalf of or in order to stop a particular candidate or party it just takes us even further down an ugly path.
Well, I'm following up on your discussion with Jim Grant. At what point does the concern for attacks on democracy, that we got to protect democracy, start in political, just opposition to Trump? And so, a lot of times I know for myself, I'm not a Trump fan, but I go, am I just not a Trump fan, or am I really concerned that democracy is under attack and we're on the verge of fascism? How do I tell the difference in that?
That is so far over my pay grade, Robert. I will offer you this. I worry about democracy too, but I worry about the threat not posed by a particular candidate or office holder or faction. I worry about the threat to democracy posed by a gradual diminishment of the belief of the populace in the ideals that made our democracy work for so long. I don't know if you saw it. There was a Wall Street Journal poll yesterday. Asked voters about their economic future as opposed to their democratic future. And I was struck by how incredibly dour the attitude of Americans were about their country's future. And look, our economy isn't great, but it's not horrible. And I believe that their outlook on a question about the economy is shaped by their broader outlook on bigger questions about our democracy. And I feel like it can't be a completely separate conversation, but it can't be a captive conversation to a political campaign either. We need to have a more serious campaign about how we re-engage voters in a political process that they've lost more and more faith in. You do that, and I think the ability of any candidate, any woman or man to threaten democracy becomes much less. The democracy becomes much more vulnerable when it's weaker because of our own disillusionment.
Thank you.
Okay.
I know I'll just give a quick plug for my favorite organization, Teach Democracy, which teaches civic education and the education to high school and middle school kids nationwide. So that's the protection for everybody.
And I will put in a corresponding plug for the Californian for Civics Learning Organization, on which I'm on the board, that does the same thing here in California, having decided that one single semester of civics in 11th and 12th grade is not really appropriate preparation for a lifetime as a citizen and as a voter. Maybe we need to give them a little bit more than that. So you and I are completely on the same page on that one. We'll do one last question. We've gone a little bit over, so let's do one last question, then we'll wrap up.
Well, getting to the point that Jim Grant and Bob Aronoff were talking about, Kamala Harris did run the threat to our democracy off and on during her campaign, and that's not the issue that people care about. Whether they should or shouldn't is not the issue. Most people do not understand that what democracy is or isn't. As James Carville said, it's the economy, stupid. And so people could talk esoterically about democracy and civics education, with which we all agree, but when people walk into the polling booth, I don't think that's how they vote. Secondly, Trump has lost 2 cases now on using the emergency power. One was sending in the National Guard, but he also lost a case on tariffs, where he cited the International Economic Emergency Act as a reason for raising tariffs, and the court was very clear that he did not have the authority under that act to impose tariffs. So the concept of invoking emergency powers really has been brought short by 2 court decisions.
Okay. So I will simply tell you that if it hadn't been for the National Guard, I promise you we were going to talk about tariffs tonight on the webinar, because I think it's of critical importance. And next month will be the 3rd consecutive month that we promised to talk about tariffs, and hopefully we actually will. But I think it's of immense import. And I think it's interesting to me how quickly the administration appealed the decision. I would have thought they would have been perfectly happy to let it fester for months and months and months. But the fact that they're back in court so quickly means they're really scared. And that's a longer conversation, which I think we really do need to have. As far as democracy, thank you for giving me a point to clarify. If I were to ever run any of you for office, I'm never going to run Grant. We know that. But if I were, but let's say I was going to run one of you for office, I would tell you exactly what Carville did, which is pick 3 issues that tangibly affect voters' daily lives. Democracy is not that kind of an issue. I would argue that a candidate can't be, for all the reasons that you mentioned, a candidate can't be the individual to talk credibly about democracy, because definitionally it's a self-serving argument. I think that that argument about democracy has to come in between elections and from non-candidates. And I think that's why Robert and so many others and me and so many others are invested in civic learning. Because I think when a Democrat talks about when a candidate talks about democracy, it just sounds hollow. I'm good, they're bad. I'm for democracy, they're not. But if you think back to Tocqueville's conceptual framework of us as a country of community-based organizations, which is not the case anymore than it was in that day, and that becomes the framework for rebuilding democracy, I think you do it outside the campaign system, because you're right. In a campaign, if I'm talking about democracy and you're talking about gasoline prices, you'll win by voice vote. But so think of it as an extra political argument. Okay. Well, guys, I think 6:45 is a new record for us. But I take it as a compliment that you wanted to talk this long and that people hadn't started to click off. But we'll do this again next month. And Brianna will remind me very, very insistently that we're going to talk about tariffs no matter what I say.
Got it.
But we'll look forward to seeing all of you in October. Thank you so much for your time and your engagement. It really
Thank
means
you
a lot.
so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks.
Bye.